Well, good morning once again, and welcome to today's AM Minnesota program. We are going to be talking about the Discovery Farms today with the Minnesota Agriculture Water Resource Center. George Rehm is the Discovery Farms coordinator. George, welcome back to the program. I always enjoy visiting with you.
Well, thanks, Jerry. It's good to be. Thanks for the invitation. It's good to be here.
Well, we have a good story to tell, and we're funding the research ourselves. So I think farmers and a lot of the farm groups, commodity organizations should take a bow too.
That's right. The funding for this project does come from checkoff dollars from the commodity organizations, and the Minnesota Ag Water Resources Center is not connected with the University of Minnesota, and it's not directly connected to Minnesota Department of Agriculture. So we're an independent organization out here trying to gather some information that's what's happening at the edge of the fields in the real world.
Well, let's talk a bit about how it all got started, this whole concept then, George. I know folks that have listened, they know all about it, but there are probably some that don't know what this is all about and why we're doing this.
Well, it all started a number of years ago with Wisconsin people. They started a Discovery Farm system, and I thought it was a good thing. And that came across the border. A number of our farm leaders listened to the Wisconsin people and said, we need to do something like this in Minnesota. So about 2010 or so, we started our first farm, and they committed some checkoff dollars to it. And I work with Tim Raditz, who lives in Wisconsin, but works both sides of the river, and we use a lot of practices and a lot of what we learned in Wisconsin we use in Minnesota. So that's how it got started, and it just gradually grew from there.
And the whole idea is then to do the scientific research to measure how much water, sediment, crop nutrients come off of a farm. So when maybe legislators in St. Paul think we're going to pass some rules and regulations, well, we can come back and say, well, here's what's actually happening on a real farm. That's it in a nutshell, isn't it, George?
Yeah, Jerry, that's it in a nutshell. There are various people who think they've got a lot of the answers by sitting behind a computer and doing so-called modeling. But there's no substitute for what we measure at the edge of the field. And in fact, we're learning gradually that the edge of the field, information from edge of field doesn't even match what the modelers predict. So the modelers have to go back to the drawing boards or square one. But there is no substitute for the actual measurements at the edge of the field, and we try and be as accurate as possible. And when you go for accuracy, you increase the expense, but that's the way it is.
How many Discovery Farms do we have up and running now in Minnesota, George?
Oh, we've got 11 core farms, and we have 2 research sites, so what we call research sites, that operate on the same principles, but they've got a little bit, they've got a different purpose. And on those research sites, we make some comparisons of what's going on. So it keeps the guy busy because these instruments are not foolproof. They're always, something's going wrong all the time.
Now, these 11 Discovery Farms, these are real farms. I mean, real working farms, right? Some livestock, some corn, soybean rotation, some alfalfa. I mean, it's the entire gamut, right?
Yeah, we have spread all the way from Goodhue County, that's a hog and cattle operation, to Rock County. We're 2 miles from the South Dakota border, and that's a cattle feedlot operation. And then we're all the way up in Norman County, grain production up there. We have different sized farms. We have some smaller farms. The one in Norman County, we're monitoring a complete section of land. So it's varied, and we try to keep these farms, as we say, representative of the diverse farming enterprises that there are in the state of Minnesota.
Well, George, if you can stand by, we have to take a break for the markets. Never a good thing when the farm broadcaster misses the markets, right?
Okay.
And after the markets end, we'll continue with today's AM Minnesota program with George Rehm, who's the Discovery Farms Coordinator for the Minnesota Agriculture Water Resource. Welcome back to today's AM Minnesota program. My guest is George Rehm, who's the Discovery Farms Coordinator for the Minnesota Agriculture Water Resource Center. And George, we briefly talked about how the Discovery Farms got started, and what was it you mentioned back in 2010? And you really have to say hats off to the foresight of some of our commodity groups, farm organizations, providing the leadership and seeing that, hey, this is something that we've got to get some scientific research on. What's coming off of farms?
Yeah, you got to take your hats off to these farm leaders, Jerry, and actually it's been a real good experience. It's been a good initiative. We actually have now some real numbers, some farms for 5 years now, and the story remains the same. What's leaving the landscape, either from surface flow or tile flow or a combination of surface and tile, is a whole lot less than what a lot of people perceive. We've shown that there's very little sediment that leaves the landscape in a tile line. We've shown that at the edge of the field, very little phosphorus is in the tile line. We've almost too small to detect sometimes, and on an annual loss basis, we might measure 1/10 of a pound of phosphorus per acre coming off the tile lines, or coming off the field through the tile lines, and those are really low numbers. So it's turned out to be a pretty good story. Farmers volunteer, the cooperating farmers volunteer to be a Discovery Farm, and they do it almost universally for the reason that they want to know what's leaving the landscape and what they're doing. And these guys are really pretty good managers. So I'm really pleased with the numbers that we're getting here in the past few years across the state of Minnesota.
Well, this whole idea about what farmers are doing and we're hurting the environment, it all kind of started years ago with the hypoxia or dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And of course, as you alluded to, somebody sitting there with their computer doing their modeling. Well, it's easy to point the fingers at farmers rather than maybe cities and people that live in town.
Yeah, and if we really knew the right answer, Jerry, I think that we had a hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico for several years prior to when there got to be a lot of excitement about it. And we know because we've kept the records now for about 25 years that the extent of that hypoxic zone varies with year. And if we get a hurricane that comes through the Gulf of Mexico, it stirs things up, and the extent of the hypoxic zone decreases. So it's just not nutrients coming down the Mississippi from the Midwest. There's a lot of factors involved in this environment. The big environment that we live in is pretty doggone complex, and you can't point your finger at one thing and say, this is the cause.
But yet there are those that like to do that because then they want money to fix it. And, well, something comes to mind. What's going on with our friends to the south in Iowa with the Des Moines Water Works and the whole issue with nitrate nitrogen?
Yeah, I've been following that from a distance, and there's a lot of incomplete information. I'll just call it incomplete, that the people involved in that Des Moines Water Works Falderall have come up with, and I really think that as all this proceeds forward, that some of that missing information is going to be filled in, and we're going to find that the amount of nitrate nitrogen that comes from those three counties that they filed suit against is not the only source of nitrate nitrogen coming down the Raccoon River. So lots to be learned there yet, and I ran across an article the other day that goes back several years, and the amount of nitrate nitrogen in that Raccoon River was high before we even thought about the lawsuit from the Des Moines Waterworks.
Well, but yeah, we do have to keep an eye on how we manage nitrogen, because nitrate nitrogen is water soluble. And if it's in the soluble form in the soil, that's the only form that the corn plant can take it up. Well, it is subject to leaching through the tile lines, right? If we do get a lot of rain?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it goes through the tile lines. Our edge of field monitoring, we get nitrate nitrogen in the tile lines. And in fact, throughout Minnesota, that is if you look at all the potential forms of loss, that ranks up there right on top. There's not that much nitrogen that comes off the landscape with soil particles, surprisingly enough. Most of it in the state of Minnesota, at least, comes through the tile lines, but those numbers aren't that awful high. I mean, we can manage the application of fertilizer to minimize nitrate in the tile line. In fact, we have since the 1990s. Our rate of application of nitrogen fertilizer has dropped. Nitrogen recommendations have dropped, and correspondingly, the amount of nitrate nitrogen in the tile lines has dropped.
Well, we have an economic interest and an environmental interest to do the right thing, because we pay good money for that nitrogen and we want it there for the crop. We don't want to lose it in the tile line. So it's like we're on the same team here, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. And a lot of farmers will say the same thing. I pay good money for that fertilizer, and I don't necessarily like it going down the Mississippi River. So I'll do everything I can to keep it on the landscape. And there have been pretty substantial changes overall in how we manage nitrogen this day and age compared to the way it was 40 years ago. The industry is moving towards a split application of N, more side dress N, less fall nitrogen. And our rates have gone down, and our hybrids have become more efficient. We used to say 1.2 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of corn. Now we're down to 0.6 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of corn, and I think that number's going to go lower.
If you look at Minnesota before we started, farming it, when it was being settled, even then you would have had some nitrate nitrogen in the surface waters, wouldn't you? Even though there were no tiles and there were no farming.
That's right. This natural system that we have generates nitrate nitrogen. The prairie soils are not given enough credit for what they do with respect to supplying nutrients. One of our Discovery Farm sites, we have a field that has not had either manure or commercial nitrogen for continuous corn since 2007. The yield of that corn this past summer was 112 bushel an acre. There's nitrogen coming from that soil, and then we measure what's coming through the tile line underneath that field, and we're still getting 1.5 pounds of nitrate nitrogen per acre per year. So these old prairie soils, they crank out a lot of nitrate nitrogen, and it's something that, we're blessed that they do compared to a soil that does not have any organic matter. But we have to take that into consideration, and I think a lot of the critics of agriculture, at least, don't recognize that you simply don't get to zero. There's always some that are going to leave the system, and that's just a fact of life. Something that is what we live with every day.
That's just like you're going to get some stream bed erosion in a heavy rain, whether man is here or not.
Well, that's true, and Dr. Satish Gupta in the Soil Science Department at the university for the last 5 years has really studied the erosion or where the sediment comes from in the Minnesota River, which eventually enters into Lake Pepin, of course. But the initial criticism was, agriculture is contributing that sediment off the landscape. Not really, because the Minnesota River flows through some pretty flat land. You can't say that the erosion of that land is going into the Minnesota River, and Satish has shown that. Most of the sediment, and even MPCA now will acknowledge the fact that roughly 2/3 of the sediment in the Minnesota River comes from the sloughing of the stream banks. I'm not so sure what we can do about that, because as Mark Seeley points out, our rainstorms are more frequent, they're more intense. We don't have these all-day rains anymore in the summertime, and these intense rainfalls that come more frequently really accelerate the erosion on stream banks.
Well, if we're going to sue somebody for environmental damage, maybe we better include God and Mother Nature, too.
Well, that's a thought. Good luck with that idea.
I was thinking about what you said here a couple minutes ago, George. Continuous corn since 2007, no added nitrogen, no manure applied to that field, and the soil was still mineralizing enough nitrogen to produce over 100 bushel an acre. That's mind-boggling when you think about it.
Well, it is. You remember back in the early 80s when I returned to Minnesota, in the western part of the state, we did our best, used our best management practices, and a lot of those farmers were happy with 120, 125 bushel an acre. That's what they planned for. Well, there's been a lot of, advances. Agriculture has been really, the science of agriculture has really moved forward. Now, you have the genetically modified corn. You don't worry about corn borers. You don't worry about rootworm. You don't worry about weeds so much. And now we have hybrids that are going to be more nitrogen efficient. We know that modern hybrids take up nitrogen later in the growing season than their predecessors. And all these advancements lead to the fact that we simply are becoming more efficient in how we use nitrogen fertilizer. And if we become more efficient, we can produce more, and we can meet that challenge of feeding the world in the years ahead.
When you look at nitrate nitrogen, there are some that are saying then, well, we should just plug up all of our tile lines. But even if we didn't have tile lines, you mentioned it, then we still have some nitrate nitrogen moving off of a soil.
Oh yeah, we'd have some. It'd be the movement through the soil profile would be a lot slower. If we didn't have tile lines, we'd have more denitrification, which is a production of nitrogen gases into the atmosphere. And there's evidence that higher concentrations of nitrogen gas in the atmosphere lead to this global warming thing. Well, maybe they're right, maybe they're not. But the whole thing is we're just getting more and more efficient at using nitrogen fertilizer in our cropping systems. This is a terrific thing in American agriculture. I can't emphasize enough the strides that we've made to be more efficient in how we handle fertilizer.
So the whole idea, George, if the Minnesota Department of Agriculture would start to propose some rules and regulations, or maybe at the Minnesota legislature, then the whole idea is to have this scientific data that you've generated from the discovery farms to go up and have that be part of the discussion then, right? That's how it's
Well, that's what we hope is going to happen, Jerry. Right now, the nitrogen fertilizer management plan proposed by MDA is up for public discussion. And essentially that plan says, well, unless you farm sandy soils or unless you farm in the karst area, that's southeast 6 counties in Minnesota, those are the areas that are really going to be put under the microscope. And you're going to follow best management practices. Well, okay. For the remainder of the state, that plan is going to encourage the use of best management practices, and that's fine. I don't think, when I read that plan, I don't see any stiff penalties coming out of there. I don't see any over-regulation. I just see that I view it as kind of a nuisance. If you're educated with respect to the management of nitrogen fertilizer, if you use it judiciously, not just go out there willy-nilly and throw it around, and I don't know if anybody does that.
We can't afford to anymore, George.
No, you can't afford to anymore. I think your nitrogen fertilizer management plan's taken care of. You got to remember that it's not a black and white management program. There are so many things that affect the amount of nitrate nitrogen in our environment that you can't put your finger on one and say, this is a problem, you've got to fix it. That's not possible.
I was at a field day last summer, George, down by Blooming Prairie, and Dave Frederickson was there, the Commissioner of Agriculture. And I can't remember her name, but she was a commissioner of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And she came down. That was really cool. She sat and just visited with farmers and this host farmer, and they were a livestock farm, and they were explaining everything that they were doing. And she said she would be happy as a lark if all farmers followed the best management practices like this host farm did. And I was concerned about what maybe she might say. And I said, well, geez, I do that already. What's the big deal here?
Yeah, well, we've got a problem that there are some people who believe, based on emotion and perception and not science, that farmers are doing everything wrong. And they have a way of getting this in the media. And if we didn't have that undertone or undercurrent, we would not have to lose sleep over that at night. But, you know, what we find at Discovery Farms is, at least the ones that we're monitoring, there are not major losses of nitrogen from the system. We can manage it. We can handle it.
And point out, too, George, that while we had really nice routine rains, no real heavy rains this year, the last 3 years, those heavy rains, that was your same assessment then, even though we had, really heavy rains.
Yeah, it all depends on rainfall, Jerry. If you get a heavy rain and you get water coming off the landscape or water coming through the tile line, there will be a spike in the amount of nitrate nitrogen that you measure. But even those spikes are not out of this world. So that's the reason we do this on a yearly basis. You have to, we go on a water year, which is October 1 through September 30th, because that's actually, the crop stops growing about October 1st, and then we go into another year and so forth and so on. But the yearly losses are not that great. They're reasonable, even when we have heavy rains. 2013 was a case in point. We had some spikes. Some of that water that left the landscape was really muddy, but it came in June, and that's when the fields are not protected. So anyhow, they're not out of this world. I guess that's the message I'd leave.
We only have about 3 minutes left, George. I know you're always involved in some really good meetings for farmers, educating on how we can manage our nutrients. You have a couple coming up this winter, don't you, that you always help with?
Yeah, there is, Jerry, and the listening can write these down. February 9th at Jackpot Junction is a nutrient management conference. There's a lot of nutrients. And that's February 9th. It's an all-day program. A lot of topics, a lot of good speakers. And we're working with Fabian Fernandez on the faculty at the University of Minnesota. And there's going to be a day-long meeting in Rochester at the International Event Center on nitrogen. And that's February 23rd. And most of the speakers on that program come from Minnesota, University of Minnesota, University of Wisconsin, and then we're bringing in a couple from Kansas. We're trying to gather up the best speakers in the business to present the best information that we can. So that's what we're up to.
And then in past years, I've been to some of those, George, big crowds. Why? Because farmers want to learn the latest and how they can do a better job because they're going to be more profitable and more environmentally friendly all at the same time.
That's right. They like to come. Last year, we had 690 people show up at Mankato, and they get to pick and choose. There's no commercials, none of that. So anyhow, we try and do the best job we can to bring the latest information to farmers, and day-long event. So, but nothing else is going on in February anyhow, except the governor's water summit.
That's a whole other topic we aren't going to have time to get to. But I wanted to mention too, George, that if you were to go to the Minnesota Agriculture Water Resource Center, you could see some pictures. And later today, I'll have some pictures on our website of how you have a farm set up and the scientific instruments that you have all there. It's mind-boggling about how you could bring the science to this research.
Well, that's what it takes, Jerry. You got to have the science. You just can't you can't base regulations on emotion and perception and models. You've got to have the numbers at the edge of the field to see what's really going on.
Well, I always enjoy visiting with you, George. If I don't see you before Christmas, you and your clan have a nice Christmas. And it's your job to call me a couple weeks before those meetings to remind me so we can get some interviews on the air.
I'll be glad to do that.
Thanks, George.
You're welcome, sir.
Sir, boy, he must not know me too well. George Rehm, who's a Discovery Farms coordinator for the Minnesota Agriculture Water Resource Center. And, of course, for many years, George was a soil scientist at the University of Minnesota Extension Service.